The afternoon sun was warm, and the streets were busy with people moving about their usual routines. Maya walked quietly, her bag hanging over her shoulder, looking like any ordinary young woman returning home after a long day. Few would have guessed that she was one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the country, a woman known in the courts for her sharp mind, her calm voice, and her unshakable sense of justice. Dressed in plain clothes that day, she blended in with the crowd, unnoticed and unrecognized, as she strolled down the block, enjoying a rare quiet moment to herself. She had just wrapped up one of her most difficult cases, a trial that had taken months of preparation and long hours of work. She had spoken with witnesses, reviewed endless files, and argued passionately in front of the judge. It had ended successfully, but Maya felt drained. She wanted nothing more than to go home, have a cup of tea, and rest. The world outside the courtroom felt lighter, calmer, and for once, she let herself relax. But peace is often fragile. As Maya walked past a small convenience store, a police car slowed beside her. At first, she didn't pay attention. Police cars often passed by, and she had worked with many officers in her career. But then she noticed the car come to a complete stop. An officer stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy sound. His eyes were fixed on her in a way that made her pause. Something in his expression told her this was not a routine check or a friendly hello. "Hey, you there," the officer called, his voice loud and sharp. Maya turned her head politely, surprised by the tone. "Where are you going?" he demanded. She blinked. "I'm just walking home, officer," she replied calmly. The man frowned. "Do you live around here?" "Yes," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady and even. "Is there a problem?" Instead of answering, the officer stepped closer, studying her as if she were suspicious simply for being on the sidewalk. His hand rested on his belt as he asked again for her identification. Maya had been through enough situations in court to know this was unusual. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply walking home. But she also knew that arguing in that moment might make things worse. So she carefully reached into her bag to take out her wallet. Her movements were slow, clear, and respectful. She handed him her ID, expecting that this would resolve the situation. The officer glanced at it, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he asked more questions, his tone growing harder each time. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Why are you here?" Maya could feel people beginning to watch. A few passers-by slowed down, their eyes curious but uncertain. Nobody stepped in, though. They stood quietly, pretending to look at their phones or at the shop windows, but Maya could sense their attention. The officer suddenly barked an order that made her chest tighten. "Get down on your knees." She froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She stared at him, unable to believe what she had just heard. She wasn't under arrest. She hadn't been accused of anything. She was simply told to kneel on the pavement, like someone who had committed a crime. Maya's mind raced. Years of experience in the courtroom had taught her patience and control. She knew her power was not in shouting or resisting, but in staying calm. She looked at the officer, her face steady. Slowly, she lowered herself, her knees touching the rough concrete. She felt the eyes of the crowd burn into her, some filled with pity, others with disbelief. Inside, her heart was beating fast. She thought about the countless victims she had defended, people who had been treated unfairly, people who had trusted her to give them justice. Now she was in their place, humiliated for no reason, forced into silence by someone who wore a badge but had no sense of responsibility. The officer stood over her, arms crossed, satisfied with the scene he had created. Maya remained still, not giving him the satisfaction of fear or anger. She knew better than to react. Instead, she studied him carefully, memorizing every detail: his badge number, his posture, his exact words. This was not just a moment of cruelty, it was evidence. Evidence she could one day use. Minutes felt like hours. The sun pressed down, and the pavement was hot under her knees. A car drove past slowly, the driver's eyes widening as they saw the sight of a young woman forced to kneel on the side of the street. A teenager across the road pulled out his phone and began to record. The officer didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in his own sense of control, blind to the fact that the situation was slipping out of his hands. Maya drew a quiet breath. She remembered her father's words from childhood, "Power is not about shouting, Maya. Real power is about patience. The truth always speaks louder in the end." Those words stayed with her now. She would not fight here on the street. She would not give this officer what he wanted. Instead, she would let him believe he had won, even as she quietly gathered the strength to turn the tables when the time was right. A second police car pulled up, curious about what was happening. Another officer stepped out, looking confused as he saw Maya kneeling. He asked the first officer what was going on. The man gave a short, dismissive answer. Maya stayed quiet, but her eyes met the newcomer's. For a brief second, she thought she saw doubt on his face, a flicker of discomfort. Still, no one moved to stop it. No one questioned it openly. Maya realized how often silence protected the wrong actions of a few. But she also knew that silence, when used wisely, could become a weapon. She adjusted her shoulders and sat a little straighter, even on her knees. Her dignity remained untouched, her spirit unbroken. The officer had power over her body in that moment, but not over her soul. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know that the woman he forced onto the ground was the very person who had prosecuted some of the biggest criminals in the state, who had stood before judges and juries and spoken for justice with a voice that could not be silenced. And that was his greatest mistake. The crowd continued to watch, whispering among themselves. Maya kept her gaze steady, her breathing calm. She knew this was only the beginning of a story that would soon turn in her favor. The silence on the street was heavy, broken only by the sound of cars passing in the distance and the occasional murmur of people watching. Maya remained on her knees, her face calm, her hands resting lightly in front of her. The officer's commands echoed in her ears, but she let them pass without reaction. Years of standing in courtrooms had trained her to remain composed in the face of pressure. This was no different except that here, she was not the one questioning, not the one holding the files, not the one speaking. She was the one being judged unfairly, without reason, without respect. The officer paced in front of her, speaking as if he needed to remind her of his authority. He asked the same questions again and again: where she was going, why she was there, if she really lived in the neighborhood. Each time, Maya answered softly, never raising her voice, never letting her words show anger. But in her mind, she was carefully recording everything. Every detail mattered. She remembered countless cases where victims described moments just like this, moments when they felt powerless, when someone in a position of authority tried to strip them of their dignity. She had listened to their stories, offered them strength, and fought for their justice. Now she found herself in their place. For the first time, she understood the weight of their silence, the pain hidden behind calm expressions. The officer leaned closer, his voice sharp. "You think you're smart, don't you? Just answer the questions properly." Maya met his eyes for a brief second, steady and unwavering. "I already have, officer," she said quietly. Her calmness seemed to unsettle him. He had expected fear or tears, maybe even anger. But instead, he found a quiet strength that he couldn't control. To fill the silence, he continued to speak, his words turning into threats about what could happen if she didn't obey. Maya did not respond. She knew better than to give him what he wanted. Another car stopped at the corner, and a small group of onlookers grew. Some whispered to each other, some held up their phones, recording quietly. Technology had given people a way to capture the truth, but Maya did not count on the crowd to defend her. She counted only on herself, her knowledge, and her patience. Inside her mind, she reviewed everything she had learned as a prosecutor. She knew laws, rules, and procedures like the back of her hand. She knew what was legal and what was not. This officer had already crossed the line many times. But she also knew that her greatest weapon right now was restraint. Losing her composure could change the story in his favor. Staying calm would keep the truth on her side. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The hot pavement pressed against her knees, and the air around her felt thick, but Maya did not let discomfort show. She thought about her career, the battles she had fought in court, the times she had stood against powerful defense attorneys and won. She reminded herself that strength was not about standing tall in front of a judge, it was also about kneeling in silence when someone tried to take her dignity, yet refusing to let them succeed. The second patrol officer, who had arrived earlier, shifted uncomfortably as he watched. He glanced at his partner, then at Maya, then at the growing crowd. He finally asked, "Do we have anything on her? Did she do something?" The first officer snapped back, "Don't worry about it. I'm handling this." Maya noticed the doubt in the younger officer's eyes. Perhaps he was new. Perhaps he still carried some sense of fairness that hadn't been hardened by years of prejudice. For a moment, she wanted to speak, to tell him who she was, to reveal her identity and end this humiliation instantly. But she stopped herself. Timing was everything. Revealing too soon might cut the story short. Waiting, however, could bring the truth crashing down on the officer in a way that no one would forget. So she stayed quiet. Her thoughts drifted back to her office, to the tall shelves filled with files, to the long hours spent preparing arguments. She remembered the faces of people she had helped, the single mother who had cried tears of relief when her abuser was sentenced, the young man who had been falsely accused but walked free because Maya fought for him. She thought of them now, and in their place, she saw herself kneeling on the ground. The irony was heavy, but it also gave her strength. She had been their voice when no one else would listen. Now she would let this silence speak for her until the right moment came. The first officer grew restless. He began to pace again, his boots scraping against the pavement. His tone grew louder, not because Maya resisted, but because she didn't react at all. He couldn't understand why she wasn't breaking under pressure. A woman in the crowd whispered loudly enough for Maya to hear, "Why is she just sitting there? She should say something." Another voice replied softly, "Maybe she's afraid." Poor girl. Maya heard them, but she didn't respond. She wasn't afraid. She was planning. Every second she remained calm was another second that worked in her favor. The more the officer tried to push her, the clearer it would be to everyone watching that he was abusing his authority. Suddenly, the officer bent down closer and said harshly, "You're lucky I'm being patient. Don't test me." Maya lifted her eyes to meet his. She spoke only one sentence, her voice steady, "I am not testing you, officer. I am waiting." The words hung in the air. The crowd fell silent, sensing something deeper behind them. The officer scoffed, turning away, but his face betrayed confusion. He had no idea what she meant, no idea that the woman kneeling before him was not powerless at all. Maya straightened her back slightly, her posture still graceful even in that position. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise around her fade. She thought of her parents, of the values they had taught her, of the countless nights she had studied by a dim lamp to earn her place in the world. She thought of the oath she had taken when she became a prosecutor to protect the law, to stand for justice, and to never let fear guide her. And in that quiet moment, she promised herself something. This incident would not be forgotten. This humiliation would not be wasted. It would become part of a bigger story, one that would shine light on truth and accountability. When she opened her eyes again, the younger officer was still watching her. Their eyes met briefly, and in that silent exchange, Maya saw recognition. He didn't know who she was, but he could see her strength. Perhaps he even guessed that she was not ordinary. The first officer, however, remained blind to it all. He stood tall, convinced of his power, unaware that the ground beneath him was slowly slipping away. Maya stayed calm, patient, and silent. She knew the moment of truth was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. The crowd around Maya grew larger with every passing minute. People stood on the sidewalks, some whispering in confusion, others quietly recording on their phones. The officer who had forced her to kneel kept pacing, as if her calm silence unsettled him more than any words ever could. Maya stayed steady, her eyes clear, her back straight. She looked fragile on the pavement, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. The second officer, the younger one, shifted uneasily. He glanced again at Maya and then at the growing number of people filming. His voice lowered when he finally asked, "Shouldn't we call the sergeant? This doesn't look right." The first officer scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "I've got this under control. Don't interfere." But Maya heard the hesitation in the younger man's voice. She knew that seeds of doubt had been planted. She kept her silence, waiting, letting the officer's actions speak louder than anything she could say. The crowd saw everything, and their phones captured each second. Finally, after what felt like an endless pause, Maya decided it was time to speak, not to shout or argue, but to shift the moment. She raised her head slightly and said in a calm, even tone, "Officer, I suggest you call your sergeant. Right now." The officer stared at her in disbelief. Her voice carried no fear, only quiet authority. The crowd stirred at her words, some whispering to each other with curiosity. "You don't give me orders," the officer snapped, his voice louder than before. But beneath the anger, there was a flicker of unease. Maya didn't respond. She only repeated, softer but clearer this time, "Call your sergeant." Her tone was different. It was not a plea. It was a statement, a suggestion that sounded more like a command. The younger officer glanced at his partner again, this time more firmly. "Maybe we should. The sergeant should know what's happening here." Reluctantly, the first officer pulled out his radio. He grumbled something into it, asking for the sergeant to come to the scene. The crowd buzzed, sensing a shift in the air. Maya slowly rose from her knees, brushing the dust from her pants with deliberate calm. No one stopped her. The officer didn't even react. He was too caught up in his own pride. The minutes ticked by until a larger police vehicle arrived. A sergeant stepped out, his presence commanding instant attention. The crowd quieted. The sergeant looked around, noticing the phones recording, the tension in the air, and finally, Maya standing quietly in the middle of it all. "What's going on here?" the sergeant asked firmly. The first officer quickly tried to explain, his words fast and defensive. He painted Maya as suspicious, as uncooperative, as someone who had refused to follow orders. He expected support, but the sergeant's eyes narrowed as he listened. Then he turned to Maya. "Ma'am, can you tell me your side of this?" he asked respectfully. Maya took her time. She reached into her bag with calm, precise movements, not for her wallet this time, but for something far more powerful. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath. From her bag, she pulled out a slim leather case. She opened it and held up a golden badge that gleamed in the sunlight. "I am Federal Prosecutor Maya Roberts," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "And I believe your officer here has just made the biggest mistake of his career." Gasps rippled through the people watching. Several phones zoomed in on the badge, capturing the moment forever. The sergeant's face turned pale, his mouth opening slightly in shock. The first officer froze, his confidence vanishing instantly. The crowd erupted in whispers, "She's a prosecutor. Did he really do that to her? This is unbelievable." Maya lowered her badge but kept it visible. She looked directly at the officer who had forced her to kneel. "You treated me like a criminal without reason," humiliated me in front of strangers, and abused your authority. You didn't know who I was, and that doesn't matter. What matters is that you acted unlawfully. And you will answer for it." The officer stuttered, his voice weak, I didn't know. "I thought that's the problem," Maya cut in, her tone still calm but sharper now. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You saw me as less, not as a citizen, not as a human being, and certainly not as the federal officer I am. That says everything about your judgment." The sergeant cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I am so sorry for what happened. This will be reported immediately." Maya nodded once, her eyes never leaving the first officer. "It will," she said softly. "Because I will make sure of it." The cameras caught every word, every expression. The officer who had once stood tall with pride now looked small and shaken. He glanced at the crowd recording him, realizing his career and his reputation had been damaged beyond repair. Maya put her badge away, her movements controlled and deliberate. She didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. The truth was already too powerful. The crowd saw it, the sergeant saw it, and most importantly, the officer himself saw it. For the first time, the street felt silent. The power had shifted completely. The woman who had been forced to kneel now stood tall, and the officer who had tried to break her stood exposed. The sergeant quickly ordered the first officer aside, speaking to him in a hushed but stern tone. The younger officer looked at Maya with wide eyes, as if seeing her in a new light. He gave her a small nod, a silent gesture of respect. Maya didn't linger. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and began to walk away. The crowd parted for her, giving her space, their eyes following her with admiration and awe. Some whispered her name, others recorded her as she left, but Maya paid no attention. She had no desire for glory. She wanted only justice. Behind her, the officer stood frozen, his world unraveling. He had not only lost control of the situation but also his own image in front of dozens of witnesses and countless people who would soon see the videos online. Maya walked steadily, her steps firm, her heart calm. She had faced countless battles in court, but this one on the street was different. It wasn't about laws written on paper, it was about dignity, respect, and truth. And once again, she had proved that truth could never be silenced. The air around the scene was heavy with silence. The crowd that had once murmured now stood completely still, as if they had witnessed something greater than just an exchange between a woman and a police officer. Maya stood tall, her badge put away, but her presence carried more weight than any uniform around her. The officer who had forced her to kneel shifted awkwardly, his face pale, his hands restless. He seemed smaller now, as if the authority he once believed in had been stripped away in an instant. The sergeant, realizing the gravity of the moment, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Miss Roberts, on behalf of this department, I want to sincerely apologize for what you experienced." His voice was careful, respectful, but also filled with nerves. He knew the situation was far from simple. A federal prosecutor humiliated in front of a crowd, with dozens of videos recording it, was not just a mistake, it was a disaster for the entire department. Maya met his eyes. She didn't raise her voice or make a speech. She simply said, "This isn't about me. It's about the way power is used. If this can happen to me, imagine how many others have gone unheard." The words hit harder than any angry outburst. The crowd nodded silently, some whispering in agreement. The sergeant looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. He knew she was right. Turning her gaze back to the officer, Maya spoke with calm precision. "I don't need you to explain yourself to me. I need you to explain yourself to the law. And the law will listen." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes darted around nervously, landing on the cameras recording every detail. He understood that his career had just crumbled in front of his eyes. The sergeant, trying to regain control of the scene, asked the crowd politely to move back and give space. But no one wanted to leave. They had seen too much, and they knew history was unfolding in front of them. Still, they respected Maya's calm authority and began to step aside slowly. Maya adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her movements graceful but firm. "I'll be filing a full report," she told the sergeant. "And you'll have to answer questions not only from me, but from the public. Because they were witnesses, too." She gestured gently toward the people still holding up their phones. The sergeant nodded quickly. "Understood, ma'am." The younger officer, the one who had stood by uncertainly earlier, looked at Maya with a mix of awe and respect. He gave a small nod, almost like a silent apology, though he hadn't been the one to mistreat her. Maya acknowledged it with a faint nod of her own before turning away. But before she could leave, a woman from the crowd called out, "Thank you for standing strong. You showed us all something important today." Maya paused, glancing back at the woman with a small smile. "Strength doesn't always come from shouting," she said softly. "Sometimes it comes from silence, until the right moment to speak arrives." The crowd clapped quietly, not like an audience at a performance, but like citizens recognizing courage. The sound was gentle, respectful, and filled the street with warmth. News traveled faster than Maya could have imagined. By the time she reached her apartment, her phone buzzed non-stop with messages, calls, and notifications. The video of her calmly revealing her badge had already gone viral. Headlines were appearing online: "Federal prosecutor humiliated by officer then turns the tables" and "Quiet dignity shakes police department." Inside her home, Maya placed her bag down and sat quietly for a moment. She looked out the window at the city she had sworn to protect through her work. She thought about the irony how in a single afternoon, she had lived the very injustice she spent years fighting against in the courtroom. But she didn't feel defeated. She felt determined. The next morning, Maya walked into her office at the federal building. Her colleagues greeted her with wide eyes and whispers. Some looked at her with admiration, others with concern, but all of them seemed to know what had happened. One of her closest colleagues, Daniel, walked over and said, "Maya, I saw the video. You handled it better than anyone else could have. But are you all right?" She nodded. "I'm fine. But this isn't just about me, Daniel. This is about accountability. People saw the truth, and now they'll expect something to change." Daniel sighed. "And you're going to make sure it does?" Maya gave him a small smile. "You know me well." Later that day, she was called into a meeting with senior officials. The story had reached national attention, and questions were pouring in from every direction: government offices, media outlets, and community leaders. Everyone wanted to know how a respected federal prosecutor could be treated so unjustly, and what would be done about it. Maya sat in the meeting room, composed as always. She explained what had happened, step by step, leaving no detail out. Her words were calm, but each sentence carried the weight of truth. She didn't exaggerate or dramatize, she didn't need to. The facts spoke loudly enough. One of the senior officials leaned forward and asked, "Maya, do you want to press personal charges against the officer?" She thought for a long moment before answering. "This is bigger than personal charges. This is about a system that allows actions like this to go unchecked. I want the law to speak not just for me, but for anyone who's been in this position." The officials nodded, impressed by her composure. They knew this was not just about punishment, it was about change. Meanwhile, outside the office, the public continued to talk about the incident. Community leaders praised Maya for her patience and dignity. Social media filled with messages of support, calling her a role model of strength. Some even said, "She taught us that real power doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be true." At the police department, however, the atmosphere was tense. The officer involved was suspended immediately, pending investigation. His colleagues avoided his gaze, and the sergeant who had witnessed the scene knew there would be serious consequences. Training sessions were suddenly scheduled, Press conferences were planned, and leaders scrambled to address the public's growing demand for answers. Maya didn't watch the news coverage. She didn't need to. She stayed focused on her work, preparing for her next case, continuing her mission to seek justice in court. But inside, she carried a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because she had embarrassed an officer, but because the truth had been revealed in a way that could not be hidden again. The moment she revealed her badge had become more than just her story. It had become a reminder to everyone that appearances can deceive, that power can be misused, and that dignity, when protected with patience, can rise above humiliation. That evening, as Maya walked home once again, she passed the same street where it all began. The pavement was empty, the shop windows quiet, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. But Maya knew the truth. That street had witnessed a lesson, one that would echo for a long time. She paused for a moment, looking down at the pavement where she had once been forced to kneel. She took a deep breath, then straightened her shoulders and walked on, each step stronger than the last. The officer had thought he had power over her. But in the end, it was Maya's patience, truth, and unshakable dignity that had changed everything. The days that followed were filled with noise. The story of Maya's encounter with the officer spread across the nation like wildfire. News stations played the video repeatedly, a young woman forced to kneel, then standing tall, calmly revealing her badge as a federal prosecutor. Commentators praised her patience, calling her a symbol of dignity and quiet strength. Social media was filled with clips, quotes, and messages of support. People who had never met her spoke her name with admiration. But Maya herself remained calm through it all. She did not seek attention, nor did she enjoy the spotlight. For her, the event was not about fame, it was about justice. She continued her routine, arriving at her office early, reviewing case files, and preparing for hearings. Yet everywhere she went, colleagues and even strangers looked at her differently now. There was a new respect in their eyes, a quiet recognition of what she had endured and how she had responded. At the federal office, her supervisor called her into a meeting. "Maya," he said, "you've inspired a lot of people. The way you handled that situation showed not only strength, but wisdom. But I have to ask, what do you want to do now? Do you want to press charges against the officer personally?" Maya shook her head slowly. "This isn't about me. It's about accountability. If the system fails to act, then nothing changes. But if the system speaks, it sets an example. I want the law to decide." Her words carried the weight of her years in service. She wasn't looking for revenge, she was seeking fairness. The investigation moved quickly. The videos, the eyewitness accounts, and Maya's own testimony painted a clear picture. The officer was placed under review, his behavior condemned not only by the department but also by community leaders. He had become the face of reckless authority, while Maya had become the face of patient justice. When the hearing was announced, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, community members gathered quietly, and officials sat with folded hands, ready to hear both sides. Maya walked in, her posture calm and professional, dressed in the same way she always dressed for court, simple, elegant, without unnecessary flair. She carried no anger with her, only truth. When it was her turn to speak, she did not dramatize. She described the events plainly, step by step, just as they had happened. She explained how she had been walking home, how she had been stopped without cause, how she had been ordered to kneel, and how she had chosen silence until the right moment to reveal her identity. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, but each word struck like a bell of truth. The room was so silent that every pause felt heavy. Even those who had already seen the videos leaned forward, hanging on to her every word. Then she said something that surprised everyone. "I do not want this hearing to be about me alone. I want it to be about the larger issue. If this can happen to a federal prosecutor in broad daylight, what happens to those without badges, without titles, without the ability to defend themselves in courtrooms? This isn't just my story, it's theirs. The audience shifted, whispers running through the room. She had turned her personal injustice into a collective call for fairness. The panel of officials thanked her, clearly moved. They then questioned the officer, who stumbled through his defense, his words filled with excuses. But the contrast was too stark. Where Maya had shown patience, he had shown arrogance. Where she had offered truth, he had offered only avoidance. When the ruling came, the officer was found guilty of misconduct. He was removed from duty, and the department announced reforms to prevent incidents like this in the future. Training programs were introduced, accountability measures strengthened, and the community was promised more transparency. The news spread quickly, and people cheered the outcome. But Maya remained steady. She did not celebrate loudly. She simply nodded when her colleagues congratulated her, quietly grateful that justice had spoken. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in. Universities wanted her to give lectures. Organizations asked her to speak at events about law and dignity. Even television programs requested interviews. Maya accepted only a few, choosing her words carefully, always returning to the same message: this isn't about me. It's about respect, fairness, and the law. Her humility made her even more admired. People saw her not as someone who sought attention, but as someone who lived her values. One evening, as she walked home once again past the same street where it had all begun, Maya paused. The pavement was quiet now, the shop lights glowing softly, the air calm. She stood for a moment, remembering the weight of that afternoon, the hot concrete under her knees, the officer's harsh voice, the silence of the crowd. She also remembered the shift, the moment when she rose, revealed her badge, and spoke the truth. She smiled faintly to herself. That street was no longer a place of humiliation, it was a place of transformation. A place where dignity had triumphed over arrogance, where silence had turned into strength. As she walked away, she thought about the future. She knew there would be more battles, more challenges, more injustices to fight. But she also knew she had the strength to face them. Not just because she was a prosecutor, but because she believed in something larger: the power of truth, the importance of patience, and the dignity that no one could take away. At home, Maya poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city lights twinkled outside, and the quiet hum of life filled the night. She thought of the countless people who had messaged her, thanked her, or said they had been inspired by her story. She thought of the young girl who had written, "Because of you, I want to study law one day." Maya closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She felt tired, yes, but also fulfilled. The moment on the street had not broken her. It had revealed her strength to the world and reminded her of why she had chosen this path in the first place. And so, she lifted her cup, whispered softly to herself, "To justice," and let the quiet peace of the evening surround her.